In this lesson, we're going to deal with tax prorations. Now, let me tell you where you are in the transaction. At this point, your buyer's getting ready to go to closing, and as they're getting ready to go to closing, you're going to be asked as the agent to verify that the information on the settlement statement is correct. One of the things that's going to be on the settlement statement or closing disclosure are going to be prorations for certain things, and we're going to talk about tax, obviously, at this point. So there's a few things to keep in mind here. The math on this is actually going to be relatively simple. The downside is because there are three different ways that you do the math, it gets a little bit complicated for students. So let's focus on the simple and then let's deal with the complicated. So here we go. Tax prorations. Keep in mind that the offer to purchasing contract says that taxes will be prorated on a calendar year basis. So what I do oftentimes in these problems is I just draw a calendar. And let me remind you that a calendar year is going to be January 1st to December 30th. Now, let me remind you that we typically use what we call a banker's year, which is 360-day year, 12 months each with 30 days. This is not a test to see if you know the calendar. This is a test to see if you understand the prorations. Okay, let's talk about scenario number one. And when I say scenario number one, the fact of the matter is it's the first one I thought about. So we're going to deal with that first. So here's what's going to happen in scenario number one. We're going to call it closing prior to September 1. So that you'll know where I'm going with this, I will say to you that prior to September 1, the reason that that date is important, even though we're on a calendar year basis, is because if it's prior to September 1, the seller hasn't paid their taxes yet. There's a decent chance that they only recently got the tax bill, so there's a real good chance they have not paid these taxes yet. Well, when we talk on the closing disclosure or settlement statement, we don't talk in terms of actual dollars. We talk in terms of credits and debits. So think about this for just a moment. If the seller has not paid the taxes yet, I think in fairness, if this thing is closing on, let's call it May 4th. Call it May 4th is when the closing is taking place. Okay. Think about that. The seller has lived in this property for a period of time and they haven't paid any taxes for this year yet. That doesn't sound fair. So what would make it fair in this case at the settlement statement? Well, think about this. After September 1st, the buyer is going to own this house. So they're going to be the one that's going to pay the taxes. And the buyer is going to pay the whole tax bill. So in this particular case, I'm going to tell you, and we will tell you this in the problem as well, I'm going to tell you that the taxes are $720 for the year. Taxes are $720 for the year. Well, when you're dealing with these problems, one of my suggestions to you would be just go ahead and figure out how much the taxes are per day. So if it's 360 days in a year and the taxes are $720, does it make sense to you that the taxes are going to be $2 per day? Okay. So now that we know that the taxes are $2 per day, and we know that the close-in is on May 4th, then we start looking at how many days have transpired since January 1st through May 4th. Well, you had all of January, which was 30 days. You had all of February, which was 30 days. You had all of March. You had all of April. And then you also had 4 days in May. So if I'm doing my math correctly on this, it looks like there are going to be 124 days that the seller has lived in the property, but he hasn't paid any taxes on. So at the settlement table, what we're going to do is we're going to take those 124 days times $2 per day. My math is right. That comes up to $248. And you say, okay, well, that was interesting, Chris. What are we going to do with this money? Well, remember, at the closing table, we don't deal with dollar bills. We deal with debits and credits. So to make this fair, we're going to debit the seller $248, and we're going to give that money to the buyer as a credit. We're going to credit the buyer with this money. And it's the exact amount of money because whatever we take from the seller is what we give to the buyer. So it's 248 debit seller, credit buyer. Why? Technically, the seller's just giving them the money that for the taxes that he has used but not yet paid. Think about this. I had a student in class one day who made this comment. What she said was that, oh, this is kind of like when you go to lunch with someone and that other person leaves early and they give you the money and here, say, just pay the whole bill when it comes. Here's my money for my share. Okay. That's kind of what it's like. That was an apt description. Okay. Now, in and of itself, that would be fairly easy. The problem is all transactions do not close prior to September 1st. Some close after September 1st. So let's say closing after September 1st, but I need you to listen closely. After 9/1, taxes paid. Taxes paid. Now, we have to give you this information in the problem. Here's what I mean by this. After September 1st, in the closing, we have to tell you whether the seller has paid the taxes yet or not. There's no way for you to know how to prorate them if we haven't done that. So in this case, I'm telling you that the taxes have been paid. So let me give you a scenario. And again, I'm using the same strategy that I always do. I'm drawing out my timeline. One of the reasons I draw out a timeline is just to slow me down to make sure that I don't make any careless mistakes. Okay. So there's my year. There's my calendar year. Now, in this particular case, the question will tell you something like this. The closing occurred on 10/24. Keep in mind, I just made that up. Closing on 10/24, taxes paid. Remember, after September 1st, we have to tell you whether the taxes have been paid or not. And now I'm telling you that the taxes have been paid. All right. So then you start looking in the problem and you find out that the taxes for the year were $1,440. Okay. You also remember it's a 360-day year. Okay. So what you'll see is that the taxes are $4 per day. Obviously, on the test, we might make it a little more complicated. They're not always going to be evenly divisible numbers. It doesn't change the way the math is done. It just adds a level of complexity to it. For these purposes, I'm just going to use simple numbers. Okay. All right. So you're like, okay, I get it. I see that step and it's starting to make sense to me. We've just now broken it down to what the taxes are per day. Okay. Now the question is, what do we do about it? Well, let me remind you in this problem, the seller has paid the taxes for the whole year. Oh, but he didn't live there the whole year. And in my mind, I think in terms of, well, what would be fair? I think it would be fair if the buyer were to reimburse the seller for the days that the buyer is going to use. So let's take a look at that. Well, there's all of December, so 30 days for December, okay? All of November is 30 days in November. And then I look at the closing date, it's 10/24. So 30 minus 24 is 6 days in October. So it looks to me like the buyer is going to own the property 66 days in this year times $4 per day. I think that's $264. And you're like, okay, good job. I'm following you on this, but now what do we do with that money? What we do with the money at this point is because the seller has already paid these taxes, the buyer doesn't need to send this money to the tax office. What the buyer is going to do is reimburse the seller for these. So what's going to happen is, in this case, we're going to have a debit buyer. We're going to take the money from the buyer's funds and we're going to credit the seller the exact same amount of 264. Anytime you're taking from one party and giving to the other party, it has to be the exact same amount. It has to be the exact same amount. Okay. Now, when you go back and look at these, keep in mind, first one was closing prior to September 1st. Clearly, the taxes haven't been paid. Okay. Closing after September 1st, we have to tell you whether the taxes have been paid. You may have already figured out there's one scenario that we haven't talked to you about yet. What would happen after September 1st if the taxes were unpaid? All right. We're going to take a look at that one next. Okay, this scenario is going to be after September 1st, September 1st, taxes unpaid. Now, I hope you've picked this up from me repeating it multiple times, but if you're doing a test question on this and it's closing prior to September 1st, we don't have to tell you whether the taxes have been paid or not. There's no way the taxes could have been paid before September 1st. It's possible that the tax bills only recently went out. So prior to September 1st, we won't even tell you whether they're unpaid or not. You're to assume they're unpaid. After September 1st, though, in theory, the seller could pay them any time after that that he wanted to. So what I'm telling you is in this problem, I'm stating that the taxes are unpaid. But why? Because it's after September 1st. And in fairness, you have to know that to be able to solve the problem. I draw my timeline. Okay, it's a tax proration. So I'm going to draw my timeline. Boom, boom, 12:30. All right, in this particular case, I'm going to suggest to you that it is now 11:15, taxes unpaid. And you say, why in the world has the seller not paid his taxes yet? Well, keep in mind from a previous class that you're not penalized until like January 6th of the following year. So the fact of the matter is a lot of people in November have not paid their taxes. Well, here's what the attorney's going to do in this case. The attorney's going to say, look, there's already a tax lien. We know how much it's for. I have an idea. Why don't we take from the seller the part of the year they owned? And why don't we take from the buyer the part of the year they're going to own? The attorney collects that money, and then the attorney pays the tax office, and taxes are resolved for this year. I don't know if you picked up on this, but that's going to be what's known as a double debit. We're going to debit the buyer, we're going to debit the seller, each for amount that they would own. This will be the only case where the taxes added together will end up being what the total is for the year. So let's say in this particular case that the taxes are $1,080. Keep in mind that will be either stipulated in the problem or we have to give you a way to calculate what the taxes are. We're going to follow our rule. You know, sometimes with a math question, it's all about getting started. And if I'm doing a tax proration, the first thing I do after drawing my timeline is I take the taxes for the year and I divide it by 360 to determine that the taxes are $3 per day. Now I'm going to give you a tip on this one. When solving this one, what I always do is I solve the shortest portion first. So for example, in this case, the buyer is going to be responsible for the 30 days in December plus 30 minus 15 is 15 days in November. Okay, so that's going to be 45 days times $3 per day. And that's going to equal $135 if I did my math correct there. Let me check that real quickly. 45 times 3, yeah, is in fact $135. And that's going to be a debit to the buyer. Okay. Now, here's the way I solve the seller's side. I take the total taxes for the year. I subtract out how much the buyer paid, 135, and then I just make a calculation on that, and I believe that comes to $945. $945 debit to the seller. Now, when I add these two numbers together here, it should equal 1,080. Let me check my math on that real quickly just to make sure that I am correct. Yeah. Okay. The attorney will collect from both. It is a double debit, and they will pay the tax office so that that lien will be expunged for this particular year. So now you've seen all three categories having to deal with tax prorations. So what I'd like you to focus on is the math is not hard. It was simply dividing and multiplying, okay? What's hard is that it occurs at different times of the year. So that's what you're focusing on. You have to know your rules. Prior to September 1st, unpaid, it's going to be a debit to the seller and a credit to the buyer because the buyer is going to pay them later in the year. After September 1st, taxes have been paid. It's going to be a debit to the buyer and credit to the seller because the buyer is going to reimburse the seller for the taxes that they prepaid. And then after September 1st, taxes unpaid, double debit. And then after you do a few of these, you're probably going to be fine with the mechanics of this. So what seems like hard math to start with technically ends up being much more simple than what you think. We'll do a few more exercises on this just to make sure that you feel comfortable with it.